This is Speakeasy Theology with Chris Green.
Mark, thank you for being with us today. Thanks for making time for it.
Thank you for inviting me on. I'm looking forward to what we might talk about.
I heard you first before I'd read a word by you in conversation with Rupert Sheldrake. And I think I was making notes last night. I think it was first about consciousness or memory. And as I said before we started recording, it's funny that I can't quite remember. I know there was another conversation you did with him about prayer. In fact, you've done at least 100 of these dialogues now. Is that right?
Yeah, we had the 100th just earlier this year in 2026. Just recorded another one just now, actually, on the nature of the resurrection of the body, no less. Coming up, we range, quite broadly, but often in this area where science and religion overlap. Often too, trying to keep close to the kind of things that people might say in churches and see where that takes us, rather than just being purely scientific questions, say, or purely theological questions.
Mm-hmm. How did they come about? I don't know the myth. How did it happen first, and so that you started this series?
A few years back, Rupert published a book called Science Set Free, and published in the UK as The Science Delusion. And it was still in the era where a skepticism about religion and an assumption that somehow science had the monopoly on truth was still quite prevalent. And Rupert's own background has been very rigorously following the scientific method, but often in unconventional spaces. And so that meant that he's actually had to get very articulate and alert to both how to do good science, but then also where the limits of science fall. And so he published this book that looks at really what you might call dogmas in a pejorative sense that structure scientific investigation and, often serve it very well, but do have these limits. And he asked me whether I could help him publicize the book, which I was very happy to do. And I thought, though, that people do well to hear him, because it's not just his knowledge, but also his attitude, his spirit somehow is very valuable. There's a great wit and freedom, as well as insight in Rupert's work. And so that's how it started, first of all on the book, but quite quickly we realized that we enjoyed meeting and talking about really all sorts of things that we've been reading or thinking about. And so the rest is history.
Yes. I'm glad you do them. Those conversations are gifts. I'd recorded one with Rupert, as I said, and then I had to go to Philadelphia for a conference there. And it was a small conference, and a couple of the attendees stopped me to talk about how moving they had found that conversation. I didn't know that anyone had heard it, actually. And specifically they named what you just named about his spirit and about the way in which he carries on conversations. And you enter beautifully into that, Mark. So thank you for doing it.
Yeah, no, it's a very important element, I think. Humor is linked to levity, which originally was a spiritual dynamic that lifts you to the divine. And so Rupert has that, I think.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. You said you just recorded a conversation on the resurrection. I hadn't made any plans to ask you about that because I didn't know of it. But I'd love to hear a kind of early word on where does that go? What do you think came from that conversation for you?
Well, it's in a way, I hope it's quite a good sample of the way that we might talk. I mean, it's not planned, but Rupert has done a lot of research on post-mortem appearances, both post-mortem appearances of human beings when they die, but also actually of pets, particularly dogs and animals. He has a big database of stories that people send in about their pets, various kinds of stories. I mean, he wrote a book called Pets That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home. And so that's about pet telepathy. and he's done a lot of research trying to make the case, understand what's going on. And also, though, he has people that write in and say when they maybe smelt or felt or sometimes even saw a beloved animal that had died. And that, of course, corresponds to, actually, sometimes people say it's not a majority common, but it's really very common for people to witness in some way again. It might be a sense, it might be a smell, it might be a noise, and sometimes it's an appearance of people that they were close to after they've died. So if appearances after death are relatively common, what's the significance then of the appearance of Jesus after his death? Because very often, certainly in my experience, I mean, you guys, it might be different, but the resurrection of Jesus is treated as if it's a kind of defining miracle, as if you believe the resurrection of Jesus, then the rest sort of follows. It's like the proof miracle. But if actually appearances of the dead are relatively common, then what does that mean about the significance of the resurrection of Jesus? And so that's really the question that we ask. I guess the destination we get to is that it is a kind of a foretaste of what St. Paul calls the spiritual body in 1 Corinthians 15, which is the earliest account surviving of Jesus' resurrection, but also is reflections by St. Paul on what the resurrection of the body even means. And, Paul says, we're born an ensouled body, a suke body, and we are raised a spiritual body, a pneumatic body. And so how can the evidence that people send in to people like Rupert and other researchers have done align with that? And what does it say about that? And that's sort of what we try and unfold in the dialogue. So again, it's taking the Christian tradition, but then also more common experiences now as seriously as you can, and seeing what happens when you put them together.
It reminds me, Chris, of a conversation you and I were having just the other day there, actually, that there's, we're in Easter season right now. So like the lectionary texts that we're encountering weekly are about resurrection experiences. But it's fascinating. Something you said there, Mark, reminded me of that the New Testament texts don't seem to read these as proof experiences, like what we tend to do with resurrection texts, say, oh, these prove something about Jesus. But I don't know that that's what's happening in the gospel text at this point, which does open up that whole question about what are these types of experience, this genre of thing, what's actually maybe going on there, and how much are we projecting onto Christian experience what we think a resurrection experience is supposed to be achieving.
Yeah. Because I think you would, if they were proofs, the responses in the gospel would be different. Overwhelmingly, when Jesus appears to people, he doesn't appear to everyone, right? Just to some. And when he appears, they either don't recognize him at all, or they're terrified by what they've seen, right? So it's not like a reunion in the way that we would expect. And in those moments in which there is something like reunion, Mary Magdalene, once he calls her name, she recognizes him and clings to him. She grabs at him, and he says, don't hold on to me. So even where there is a kind of reunion with the lost loved one, that's forbidden in some sense. So there's a much greater mystery here, I think, than a lot of Christian teaching, conventional kind of Christian piety about resurrection would suggest.
Yeah, I think it's broadly inviting us into a broader sense of what it means to exist, what reality is, and prepare in this life for what follows. I think that actually, increasingly, I feel that's what the invitation is in this life. And the other element, actually, which is important, it's a bit more technical, but that I'm interested in this figure, Owen Barfield, who was the great friend of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, one of the Inklings, and Barfield and Tolkien, but so Tolkien and Lewis said that Barfield was the sort of brilliant one of the group. And one of the things that Barfield was very alert to was how words change meaning over time, and how words are what he called fossils of consciousness, so that the changing meaning of words is also a record of the changing consciousness of peoples in different times and places. And by conscious, he means awareness, how they made sense of the world, the relationship with themselves, with others, with nature, with the gods, and so on. Anyway, that's the background. But in particular, the notion of history that we have now as a evidence collecting discipline is very, very recent. I don't know, maybe 300 years or something. And prior to that, history was thought of as a telling of a story that makes sense of events, rather than asks, did they really happen, but makes sense of events. And so it's why in medieval histories, for example, you might read about dragons appearing over the hill as much as a king assembling his forces on the battlefield. The point was that all events had this huge significance and meaning. And so that's what the history sought to convey. And I think that the Gospels are a new genre, pretty much, actually. There were biographies of some sort in the ancient world, but these are quite distinctive in their form. And they're clearly stories that are told to not just report what happened, but to invite you into the experience of what happened as well. And maybe the closest we actually have to a historical report as we would think of it now is St. Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, which does seem almost like him saying to his audience that you know what happened, and so just repeating what they already know, but to us it's a report. But clearly in the Gospels, with these different stories, we're being asked to read a history that is very different. It is to participate, to use a big Barfieldian word, in that experience again. So it means a sort of triangulation. There is what happened, and I'm being realist about that. I don't think it's just a story in a pejorative sense, but there's the bridge between then and now. And so what the Gospels do is create a form that enables what happened then to still matter now. And you get a bit of this in Plato. I did my PhD on Plato, and in Plato's dialogues, the figure of Socrates is often pursued now, and you get the question of the historical Socrates, so-called, what was the actual Socrates like? Because Socrates in Plato's dialogues is very, very different from dialogue to dialogue. But that's a very modern question. It's not like Plato was trying to make it up and conceal something. Plato felt that what mattered was the encounter with Socrates, not, as it were, the bare facts of his life. And so that's what he wrote about, and in such a way that it was living. And so 2,500 years later on, you can still read them and get a sense of that. So that's a bit of a long ramble, both about the dialogue but also, I think it's just a basic confusion about the nature of history and how history changes over history.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned Barfield, and I'm just starting to read now. I've picked up your newest book, which is on Blake, and I know you've written The Secret History of Christianity is a book about Barfield. Yes. So for those who don't, like me, who don't know Barfield well, I mean, I knew he was in the Inklings. I knew he had influence on Lewis and Tolkien. And I have some friends who are kind of swear by him, as we say. And I know Poetic Diction is one of the books that has, an enormous impact. But let's start with Barfield and then shift to Blake. How would you introduce folks like me to Barfield and what he's up to? What is Barfield's contribution here?
Well, maybe I could say how I got into Barfield, which was, I mentioned doing this PhD on Plato, and, I did the work and I got the degree, but I really felt that I hadn't begun to get to grips with what Plato was really going on about. And I did my PhD in a modern university setting, of course, where analytic philosophy dominates. And what I was missing was how the dialogues aren't just rational arguments. And in fact, they're very rarely rational arguments, really. I mean, for one thing, Plato doesn't even have the word analytic. It was coined later. He talks about analogy, and that's a very, very different thing. And there's also myths in Plato's dialogues. I mean, there's myths of the afterlife, for one thing. But there's also rituals and then characters and the setting and context. There's all sorts of things going on. And my PhD left all those questions hanging. And then someone said, you need to read Owen Barfield. And in what is probably his kind of magnum opus, although it's actually quite a small book, but it was the one written more in the latter stages of his life, called Saving the Appearances. He makes this remark where he says people can read the whole of Plato and even write books about him and have not understood a single word. And his point is that the words might stay the same on the page, but they just carry very, very different meaning and resonance over time. I mean, an example would be theory. A theory now means a proposal that you seek evidence for. Whereas in Plato's time, a theory meant it still carried resonances of going on a kind of journey, almost like a pilgrimage, to a sort of horizon. And if you looked over the horizon, then the world would expand. And so this, set me on a trail reading Barfield, with this sense that, as he calls it, consciousness evolves, the evolution of consciousness. But then this also really helped me with my Christianity, because I couldn't really find a very satisfactory account of the figure of Jesus, particularly when, since the Reformation, that tends to be led in soteriological terms, and very often some sort of substitution theory, and I just didn't warm to them at all. They left me cold. If not, if they're particularly ferocious forms of substitution theory, finding that rather abhorrent about what it says about God. So Barfield, though, his account is that with this way in which people's consciousness changed over time, the figure of Jesus becomes so important because it crystallizes in people's lived experience a kind of pivot. And the pivot is what you might call the birth of a modern sense of individuality. And this shows up in Christianity because Jesus was seen as the person who was both fully human and fully God. And they weren't two things that somehow had to be plastered together, but there was something about the fullness of his humanity that was also the fullness of the divine transparency in the encounter with Jesus. The two were coming together. And this is an evolution. There's a backstory to this because it's not the dominant thought in the Hebrew Bible. It wasn't the dominant thought in the ancient Greek world. And then these things come together in the 3 or so centuries before the time of Jesus in Hellenistic Judaism. And so something's happening, something's unfolding. And in particular, Barfield shows how using words, you can show how an experience of what it was to be an individual was being born that came together at the time of Jesus and then in the person of Jesus. And in particular, the sense of an individuality that's gathered makes it possible to perceive the unity of the divine in monotheism. Whereas previously, say, 500 years or so before Jesus, polytheism was the dominant mode because people didn't experience themselves as gathered into a human unity, but in a kind of more shared or collective sense of belonging. And so that fitted the polytheistic perception of things. So if that makes sense, it gave me anyway a way of relating to this figure of Jesus that both made sense historically, but also mattered to me now, because of course that's our perception now. And I'm particularly drawn to mystical forms of Christianity, where the prime focus is on the divine awareness as an immanent experience of transcendence within yourself. And then, of course, within all things as well. as Augustine puts it, God being closer to us than we are to ourselves. So anyway, Barfield really helped me kind of own this fairly fundamental bit of Christianity, i.e. what do you make of the person of Jesus? And I became convinced, and this book you mentioned, A Secret History of Christianity. Secret because it's not much talked about, and Jesus also very often in the gospel uses his phrases, do you have eyes to see, do you have ears to hear? The secret is even a word that's used in the synoptic gospels for this inner shift of perspective that reveals these things.
Yeah, and there's the, in Mark, the so-called messianic secret that Jesus himself is keeping, and Paul says the mystery, has been kept for the end of the age. So yes, I'm not all the way through it, but there was a line where you were talking about the relationship between, in A Secret History of Christianity, about imagination and incarnation. And it seemed to me that's the thread, perhaps the thread that's connecting Dante, Barfield, and Blake for you. But you say something close to this, that for Blake, incarnation and imagination are part of one seamless action. They're inseparably bound up, one seamless action. So I think maybe let's work from there. Like, what did you mean by that, and what does Blake mean, and Barfield, and so on? Because that seems to me to be like a kind of thunderous claim. I think it's right. I just want to make sure I'm hearing it clearly.
One of the things that Blake is very clear on is that imagination is not something that you might have, I might have, an artist like Blake has for sure. It's the other way around for him. Mm-hmm. He thinks that the imagination has us, and it's the divine imagination. So imagination for Blake is the dynamism that we routinely experience. We're talking now. Strictly speaking, in a physicalist worldview, I'm just issuing vibrations on the air. They get transported through the wonders of modern technology, and then you hear them as vibrations on the air as well. But of course, we don't hear vibrations on the air. We hear words, and words that, with luck, carry some meaning, are taking us actually all over the place. They're not just relating to our immediate environment. We're exploring things, that range over centuries. And that hearing of vibrations as words, and words that are transporting, is the imagination at work. So the imagination is always at work in us. You don't have to worry whether you feel you have imagination or not. And that living experience is the logos, in, to use the more traditional term that Blake aligns really with imagination. The logos is the creative impulse that runs through all things, and not just, as it were, at the beginning, but the continual creation of all things, which is their participation in the life of God. And language, has a particular place in that because of the resonance of the word logos. So that's why imagination and logos and creativity and existence run together in Blake. But there's a bit of a nuance to this, which I think is fascinating, that if you also have this sense that consciousness shifts over time, then I think the imagination becomes particularly important to we moderns. Because I think in the medieval and late antique world, and probably before as well, your thoughts, and the images you saw, you wouldn't have assumed that they were, as it were, generated from within your brain or your body or your skull. That would not have been a natural assumption at all. It would have been much more like you're in a whole flow of thoughts and images, that would have been carried by angels or daemons or demons, or the place, the spirit of place, the loci genii, all these various, features of an enchanted cosmos. And so these things were flowing through you, and you had a part in them, and there was will, and so on. But if you read figures like Thomas Aquinas on your will, or Dante for that matter, it's very much about how to negotiate through this rich pageant of meaningful flow and vitality. Whereas now, in the modern world, particularly since the 18th century, we've become cut off, at least by default, from that wider flow. And so at least the official scientific story is that somehow consciousness is generated inside me and it's generated inside you. And perhaps if we're lucky, there's some meeting of that. And I think this is where the imagination is so important to us now, because the way that imagination works is that we certainly know it as our own possession, if you like, but we also know it is connecting with others and with the world around us. This is why art is so important, and indeed why science is so successful, because the scientific imagination can connect to the world as it actually is. And so the theories prove their worth in technology or in the development of further theories. But what's happening then, Blake said, is that, and Barfield certainly says this, is that, as it were, the imagination that comes out of us connects with the imagination that's around us, which we experience, then you might say, is inspiration. It's like, oh gosh, yes, that's the way it is. And you feel that sense of connection. And so it's reforming what would have been the assumption before. That's the long-winded point I'm trying to get to. Because we've lost this automatic assumption that we're in this flow of meaning that's around us as much as within us, the imagination becomes this crucial way in which that reconnection can be regained. And regained not just to, as it were, recover, but to remake, because it brings in this extra inflection, which I think is so important in the modern world, that it just which is to enhance our freedom that little bit more. And I think one of the features of the modern world is a sort of obsession with freedom, and that can undo people, but it also is really important, and I think is part of the ongoing divine unfolding, actually. And so if you know yourself, if you've had the experience of knowing yourself as separate from things, but then reconnecting, then that brings an extra capacity for a kind of active reconnection. You can bring that bit more of yourself into the connection. And I think that there's something like that going on in our world at the moment, which is to say, we're being called as free spiritual creatures in this return to God. But maybe now is a phase in particular where we're working on this sense of what it means to be a free spiritual creature, and not one that just follows the divine, as it were, by nature.
Yes, I'm really struck by that thought of being obsessed with freedom, and I want to circle back to that in a moment. But let me ask you a question about imagination. And I was in a conversation a few years ago, and someone put to me a question like, "How would you describe imagination?" And I just kind of off the cuff said something to the effect of, "It's not a faculty that I have by which I make things up. It is a capacity that makes it so that I can be more fully present to what's actually there." Does that seem consonant with what you're saying?
Yeah, definitely. That's wonderful. That sounds very, very good. I mean, it needs discerning, because clearly we can get things wrong in our imagination. I mean, there's a useful distinction that is made by Coleridge, the near contemporary of William Blake, where he calls it, when we make something up that doesn't connect, that doesn't make us more present, he calls that fantasy. But then when our imagination helps us to participate in what Coleridge calls, the divine imagination, the primary imagination, that's the imagination we're talking about, with this capacity to be present. Yeah. And it's wonderful because it's not just a presence, like when you're in the cinema, just sort of mute, with the noise and the sound and everything kind of coming at you, and all you have to do is sit there. The point of the imagination is you do have to do a bit of work. It does invite your agency to participate. You can train yourself, you can develop it, you can discern it. But then, of course, that means you're more present because of the work that you've done too.
Well, that's what I was hearing, at least some of what I was hearing in the line in your book about incarnation and imagination being identical, one seamless action, in that both what is given and what is received is the work of God, no less the work of God in me receiving what God has given me than in God giving it to me in the first place. So that and I don't know Blake at all, but it sounds to me what I'm picking up from you is that sense in which imagination might be another way of naming what Paul calls the mind of Christ. We have the mind of Christ. Who could know the works of the Lord, but we have the mind of Christ, right? And that does that. How does that strike you? Is there some connection there, you think?
Yeah, definitely. And that's precisely it. And Blake gives it this extra twist, which he says that the imagination is the body of Jesus, of which we're a part. And I think he, rather than calling it the mind of Christ, Blake was very, very knowledgeable about the New Testament. You know, he was an autodidact and learnt the Greek and everything. But he likes the idea that we can give it this extra twist in the modern world and challenge ourselves to know not just this is a sharing in the mind of Christ, but this is a participation in the body of Christ. And it doesn't mean, you know, some metaphor for the church. No, he means that everything that's tangibly perceived around us, and of course that which is less tangibly perceived, is to be part of this living, dynamic body that is, I don't know, you might call it the cosmic Christ or something like that, just to give it a bit of help. But, you know, Blake says Jesus is the imagination. He talks about the human form divine. When Blake writes his poetry, he often says that he says routinely they were inspired, but he'll even say he heard the voice of God, and he'll hear the voice of God saying, you know, I am in you and you're in me, mutual in love divine. I'm not a God afar off. I'm a brother and a friend. I dwell in you and you dwell in me, which, of course, is actually fairly standard Christian mysticism. It's not sort of sui generis to Blake at all. I mean, Blake will often quote the church fathers who say things like, you know, therefore God becomes as we are so that we might be as he is. But it's got a bit lost, particularly since the Reformation, which is why it can seem a bit surprising.
That's a perfect opening to the question I wanted to ask. And David, help me formulate this question, but something along the lines of how so much of our preaching and teaching ends up deadening the gospel. I just had a conversation with Jane Williams, as I told you, and one of the things we discussed is somehow we've made this boring, this being the story of God and the gospel. How do we make that seem lifeless?
Yeah.
So I wonder if you could, David, maybe help me find a way to ask this question, but something about what is happening there with our preaching and teaching that is unimaginative in the worst sense, and then what might we do to make it so that when we're talking about Jesus, it does awaken imagination. It's not dead. How would you put that, David? How would you ask a question like that?
Trying to track some of the conversation, it struck me that what we're trying to do as preachers at some level is about our resistance to that which draws us into image, that which draws us into contemplation, might in hand have something to do with our resistance to the imagination and what we think we're doing with preaching. So, like, do we come sometimes in the modern context to a sermon that we're trying to take a story and turn it into some dogma, or a story and turn it into some constitute parts, whereas our history is about drawing it up into a bigger, a more imaginative world?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is I'm not sure how to ask the question without narrowing it down too much. So I think Mark, you can probably sense what we are gesturing toward. So I mean, just let's see what it stirs up for you. I mean, and you've done some preaching yourself, so I know this is something you can speak from both sides of the experience. I know.
Yeah, I mean, just to that last point, you know, I can't actually preach anymore. I freeze up at the side of pulpits, but that's no doubt says a lot about my personal story and you know, so I used to be a priest in the Church of England, and I left quite a long time ago, like well over 20 years. So it's mostly my personal story, but I think that there is something about that which maybe is relevant to what we're pursuing here. I mean, I've got two thoughts and see whether they touch on what we're trying to reach towards. And the first one actually is the very reaching, because I think that any kind of spiritual conversation or exchange of words works best, i.e., actually invokes the presence of God, when the speakers recognize that they're not just having a kind of bilateral exchange of ideas, or being told things, or receiving things, but where there's a mutual sense of trying to reach into a shared space, and that all the participants are trying their very best to find the words that enable that shared space to become clearer, or become more present, and become more felt by those in that shared conversation. And of course, the point about that is the divine presence, and that we search for the words, or maybe the image, which is the use of the imagination, not just to communicate a thought that I have in response to a thought that you have, or a teaching that I have in response to a teaching that you have, but that to which the whole lot is pointing might become more palpably present to people. So it's only to say that a sermon that brings a felt sense of the divine life there and then is the wonderful sermon, the sermon of imagination. Whereas the sermon that heckles about something that's going on in the world, or tries to communicate the intricacies of a doctrine, or they can be fine, but they're not really about the divine presence, and they're about belonging in this world. And this is my critique. I think far too much modern Christianity, certainly the Christianity that I know, which is sort of Reformed Catholic, if that's what you think of Anglicanism as, has become moralizing. Christianity has just too much become a kind of moral creed, and with the best of intentions to help people live well, live better in community, champion justice, and so on. And these are important things, but I think that they're told at the expense of the divine presence itself, because one of the things that strikes me very much about these Gospels is they're not very interested in morality. The parables will be a classic case to me. They're often told as if they're moral stories, and one or two of them work that way, notably the Good Samaritan, but most of them really don't. They're about something else entirely, and I think they're about the strangeness of the divine presence, and then an invitation to step into that field that the story might create. But that's my sort of that's my finger wagging semi-sermon against the sermon that is where you just go and you hear complaints about the modern world, basically, and how Christianity would do it better, and it's just tedious. It's obvious to so many people, and it doesn't really take you anywhere, as you can see. That's one of the reasons why I can't step into pulpits.
Yeah, it's deadening in all those ways. I'm really struck by something you just said about the Good Samaritan parable. So one, I do completely agree that we've kind of misconstrued what the parables are and what Jesus' teaching is. Like we often talk about Jesus as a kind of plain, simple teacher, and I'll sometimes say to my students or in sermons, literally nothing could be less true than that. Like you can't find an instance in any gospel where Jesus says anything that anybody understands, and that it's not he's anything but a clear, kind of didactic sermonizer, right? In the way that word, talk about a fossil of consciousness. Like think about what sermonizing now means, right? That it is a condescending, flattening, unimaginative way of speaking, right? That you're lecturing someone, or you're sermonizing, you're preachy. I've tried to say in the past, we need to recover something like preacherliness, which is speaking, I think, with elevated spirit, but never be preachy. Right? Karl Rahner has a wonderful prayer in which he says, "Lord, make me a man of the church, but not a cleric." And I think, Lord, make us preachers, but not preachy, right? Don't let us sermonize about these things. So I love what you're saying here. And I think that you hit the nerve with this reference to the Good Samaritan parable. So Yvonne Illett has written talked about this over his career, about the kind of corruption of Christianity. And he would often appeal to that kind of old Latin proverb that the corruption of the best is the worst. And that Christianity has this shadow side that is moralism. And he thinks it's specifically the Good Samaritan parable and the way in which the church comes to hear it, or Christendom comes to hear it, versus the way Jesus told it, that tells the tale of that, right? So he says we hear it as a parable about being good neighbors. Jesus told it as a parable that shattered the moral framework of the world, that this Samaritan is the one who did right by this man who was in distress, not a call for us to aspire to be good neighbors, but to recognize that anyone in need is my brother. Anyone in need belongs to me, and I'm responsible for them, which then shatters all of our all the lines we've drawn, and all of the rules we've made for living. So I think it seems to me to be exactly it. Like that Christianity, when it's diseased, it becomes moralizing. It sermonizes rather than preaches.
I love Yvonne Illich's reading of the Good Samaritan, and I think that apropos my thought that somehow freedom is a key issue in the modern world, I think Illich was onto that as well, because I think what enables the Good Samaritan to respond in the way that he does is that he's free. He's able to be spontaneous in the moment, not concerned with the things that the others were concerned by, and so participate in life as it struck him in that moment. And that's the kingdom of God that's within you. That's the kingdom of God that's near. And so the parable is about how to participate in the kingdom. And I think particularly this idea that the Good Samaritan is the free one that can let go of whatever needs to be let go of in the moment in order to share in this, well, the connection that's very human in that moment. But then, of course, that's just a fragment of the unity that you're speaking to there as well. And so, when you can talk about a parable that brings it back to life in that way, and you feel the very life in the story, and you feel it as an invitation that you might know of as well. That I think is the divine imagination that's present again in the story.
There's a way. This is also something else from Blake, where he would pick up on I think you call it aura of people, and see what images that stirred up, right? So I think one thing I'd like to ask you about is that sense of the moral aspects of imagination that aren't moralizing. So there is a kind of recognition of disease, of a sickness, like something smells off here, something isn't quite right. But that is something very different from being moralizing, being pharisaical, as we've come to use the term, although that's not really fair to the Pharisees by and large. But I wonder if you could speak to that and maybe direct us to what Blake might say about how do we kind of smell rightly the putrefying effects of something that's diseased, something that's gone wrong in us, in people around us, in the culture, in our church or churches, without being judgy, without being pharisaical, right? In that way.
Well, here's a thought. And again, I think it's something that's intruded really relatively recently. And it happened in Blake's lifetime. In the 1780s, two new modes of doing morality were invented that have now dominated moral discussion. And one is called utilitarianism and the other is called deontology. And utilitarianism was invented not far from where I am now by Jeremy Bentham, and is the principle that the good life is that which brings the greatest happiness to the greatest number. And then deontology was invented in Prussia by Immanuel Kant, at almost the same time, actually, just within a year or two of each other. And that is the notion that what's good is received by a kind of rational fiat, like don't lie. And what is common about those two modes is that they extract the individual out of the moral decision. That both are a kind of calculation. In Jeremy Bentham's case, it is what he called philosophic calculus, literally working out what brings the greatest happiness. If more people like apples than pears, then you put more apples and pears in your supermarkets, kind of thing. And then deontology is this kind of objective rationalism that's going to tell you what to do. And what gets lost then is the interiority of the moral actor or society. And it's part, therefore, of this modern move to strip out interiority, except for these kind of flickering candles that are somehow supposed to produce consciousness inside your skull and mine. And I think this is disastrous for moralism, for morality. It turns it into moralism because it's no longer, it's not inviting you into a richer life where what's good and evil, what's light and dark, what's beautiful and ugly, what stinks and what smells beautiful flows right through you and me. And therefore our task is to kind of navigate all that. Instead it preaches at you and says, this is right, this is wrong. And of course that's fragmenting as well. I think that's why we find ourselves at the impasse so much that we are now, because when it's preached at you, the almost immediate response is that's right or that's wrong. I'm for that or I'm against that. Your friend, your foe. And sure enough, the algorithm then even amplifies that even further because it's binary too. But I think that this is the major problem, that morality has come to be seen as these kind of calculations or rational assumptions that you have to obey, rather than the older way, which obtained in the medieval world and the ancient world, was what's now called virtue ethics. So what matters is your character, your personality, who you're becoming, what life is shaping you. So leaning into, we're all in this mess together, and how do we smell the sweetness of beauty that might draw us towards that which is good, rather than the condemnatory, they're bad for sure, so don't get messed up with them. That is one mode anyway that you can come across these days. And and to the Pharisees, the Pharisees, I think that they participated in a way of life that was a kind of everyday mysticism, that you obeyed the rules, not so much because it was right or wrong, but because it led you into a better relationship with God. Again, it was sort of working on your inside rather than just like being programmed like a robot. So, even the poor Pharisees have got, the way that they're often received, like you're saying, has got caught up in this really very, very recent twist in the story of virtue and ethics. A couple of 100 years old, now very dominant. But I think, we need to push back by plunging back into, if you like. The practical point, the practical way of responding to this, for example, is don't decide, you for or against. Instead, try to hold that space as a field to enter into. So, Blake talks about how without contraries is no progression. And he talks about the marriage of heaven and hell. And what he's saying there is that, okay, we do live in this world that has got kind of stretched on these moral poles. But perhaps those moral poles, like the poles of a magnet, which of course was a science that was very much developing in Blake's time, they can be perceived now as opening up a field of possibility. And so entering into that field, which of course is the place of dynamism and spirit and so on, and asking how you experience it, how you can participate in it, what you can contribute to it, bringing back the interiority is a crucial move, I think.
Well, and that interiority, this is to your line again about incarnation and imagination being a seamless action, that there is a kind of self-obsession in which I am talking about myself that narrows and flattens and deadens. But there's a way of speaking from my heart that opens out and includes. And to come back for a moment to our conversation about how have we made this faith lifeless and boring. I think it's because we don't know the difference between those things. There's a kind of interiority, and I'm thinking about Origen here, that each one of us is a microcosm of the whole. Everything that is in me, and my insides are made to hold all of that. So one of Lewis's, I think, truest intuitions was about this, right? That everything, this is an inside in which everything can fit, right? That's the inside we're made for. And there's a kind of interiority that opens up on that. And I'm sure you encounter this all the time as a therapist, as well as a philosopher, that there's a kind of self-obsession, a turning in on myself that, again, gets smaller and narrower and darker. I'm going into the caves of my memory and getting lost there. But Augustine goes into the caves of his memory, and it opens up literally to everything, because it opens up to God. So talk to us for a moment about, maybe for lack of a better word, good and bad interiority, a good and bad kind of self-reflection. And how do I go within in a way that's truly imaginative, that opens me up to the incarnation, to the divine?
Yeah, no, it's a very important point, because individuality quickly becomes individualism, and is therefore a kind of interiority that cuts off, as if everyone is just isolated monopoles bumping into each other. Whereas I think this is a rather dry way of putting it, which I'm conscious of, having said that we need to feel the vital ways of speaking about these things. But the going in that realizes that the heart of ourselves is not our own. It doesn't belong to us, but is the divine presence, is the divine gift. So that's a going in that opens up. And I think you get this in the mystical traditions, where you have these two paths, the way of negation and the way of affirmation. And so the way of negation is at once taking away all that you think that you have, and seeing what's left, and what's left is God. But then that is the precursor to the way of affirmation, which is then seeing that that's true for all things. And so then you see all things in their true light, which is, like yourself, as many reflections of the divine presence. And so that is an interiority that connects, because the bad interiority, if you like, is the one that tries to possess, say, this is mine, and phrases like true self, can play into this. There's a kind of way in which true self is used to mean this is what is mine, that I can be sure of, certain of, that will robustly or resiliently stay with me. But it's sort of against the rest of the world, if you like. But this is an interiority that actually, the path is to recognize you have nothing. It opens you as, I'm very fond of the book, The Cloud of Unknowing. And the author of The Cloud of Unknowing will talk about just a naked intent, a bare presence. Everything's gone into what he calls the cloud of forgetting, everything, creatures, everything. And you're just left with this love towards the cloud of unknowing. But the strange thing is that way of negation is the way that true life returns, because then you realign, you reorientate through the practice, through grace, of course. You don't know how it works, but you trust, and then you begin to maybe get glimpses that it does work, that there's an interiority that is the divine presence, and it's not just in you, but it's everywhere is the face of God, as the Sufis put it.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is Eckhart, right? I think it's so easy to misread. And here I'm thinking again about McGilchrist's work, right? That there's a certain way of thinking about this kind of mysticism that is just self-obsessive. And I think you're exactly right about the true self-talk. Maggie Ross, I don't know if you're familiar with her, but she talks about how dangerous she thinks that language is, that language of the true self. And she says a lot of spiritual direction fosters the worst kind of self-obsession, right? That it makes you more and more self-conscious but not truly self-aware. So I think there's something here that goes right to the heart of the sickness I think we're all kind of catching, right, passing around right now, which is we're probably more in touch with ourselves than humans have ever been, but maybe less in touch with that imaginative interiority that is humbling, that is truly divinizing, right? That really sanctifies and alters our lives for good. And so what comes out of us then is moralistic. It's sermonizing. It's prosaic in that in the worst way. I do think, and we're almost out of time here. I don't want to let you go before I ask you to talk about a story I heard you share. And I think that for me, and I'll just testify at this point, like for me, I think the turn started with a sense of the communion of the saints. And so I've been thinking about this now for a few years, and it's come up in almost every conversation that I've had over these last few years because of an experience I had at my consecration. In fact, as a bishop, it was this overwhelming sense of being surrounded with presence, that the living and the dead are one, that there is a way in which my grandparents are here with me, and they're here with me more intimately than they were when they were in the room with me. And I don't need to say a lot more about that. I think you can sense what I'm saying here. And I remember the conversation you had with Rupert about spirits of place, patron saints, and there's a moment in that conversation when he says he has this wonderful line about essentially the saints are standing around unemployed, waiting on us to actually ask them to act. They want to help, but we've forgotten that they're there to help. And he also made the point that to be a saint is to be given this kind of responsibility in the afterlife. That he says something like they don't get to go on and enjoy the bliss of God. They have to stay around for years and years and years to help us. And then you responded by saying, well, maybe that is the blessing of God that they're experiencing. They're bringing that to us. But out of that exchange, which I hope everyone will track down, you then shared a story about Madonna Lactans, and I don't want to spoil it for anyone, but I think here at the end, if you could tell us a bit about that conversation, because for me, and this is why I'm asking you about it, like there's something about when I started to realize that I could make all of these claims about Jesus that I'd been told needed to be made. I could make these claims about God that the theology I'd been given made about God. But it didn't seem real until I started to actually experience what that meant for people I had known, including my grandparents, and for others like me, and ultimately, most importantly, Mary, that I realized, oh, that's what we mean when we say this about Jesus. That's what we mean when we say this about God. That somehow it hadn't come home to me until I realized what it meant for others other than Jesus, other than God. So that's some of the reason it's the connection that I'm seeing with what we've been discussing. But maybe share with us that story, or what you would like to share of that story, and what that has to do with imagination and incarnation.
Yeah, well, the story is about a church in Yorkshire, in a little place just outside Skipton, which I've been involved with a little bit through a kind of retreat centre called Broughton Sanctuary. And through Rupert Sheldrake, who is very keen on pilgrimage, we did a little mini pilgrimage to the local parish church, which is very ancient, probably 1,000 years old, but not much visited these days. And we went in, and much to our surprise, in a side chapel, which was a lady chapel, was a figure of that's known as Maria Lactam. So that's Mary breastfeeding Jesus. And it was clearly pre-Reformation, and they're very rare in England. And the rarity matters because the next time I was going to this place in Yorkshire, I made a wrong turning off the motorway and got a bit lost, and then realized that I'd ended up in the village where there's, as far as I know, is the only other surviving statue of Maria Lactans in the country. And so this felt like, quite a synchronicity. And I still don't quite know what it means, to be honest. And that's often the way with these wonderful things, that you live with them and let them keep calling you forward somehow. But it was something about receiving the divine presence, because it made me do a bit of research, and I discovered that often these figures of Mary breastfeeding Jesus were placed above and behind the altar. So the experience for the person receiving communion was to experience it as a kind of line of reception, that you would receive the body of Christ and the blood of Christ, and see, as it were, out of the corner of your eye, Christ receiving the milk of Mary, which in the medieval imagination, because both milk and blood give life, they were sort of one aspect of the same reception. And so you'd see a kind of chain of being, with the implication that Mary, of course, had received from God in conceiving Christ. She then gave to Christ in her milk. You're receiving Christ in the body and blood. So you get this wonderful line of giving and receiving, and participation, therefore. So, there is doctrine around Maria Lactans, if you like, but it was much more to enter a kind of zone of divine outpouring, amplified because of the figure behind the altar as you were receiving communion. So it was perhaps not so far away from what you're talking about with the communion of the saints there. This sense of participating going on at all sorts of different levels and dimensions, of which the most immediate and physical is only one part. But I also, it made me think, it's maybe related to this business about true self and so on, because I think that what is valuable about modern psychology, which someone like Maggie Ross, I think, rightly criticizes too, is that it is a kind of exploration of yourself, knowing yourself. But it's only a preparation to therefore knowing more than yourself. It's something about discovering the kind of limitations of who you are, in order that then you can feel a space from which more can be received. And that's the bit that gets missed out. And I don't know, the author of The Cloud of Unknowing, he'll talk about what he calls imperfect humility, which is knowing yourself, warts and all. But that's only a preparation for what he calls perfect humility, which is not something that you or I have at all, but that can be given to us because it's when we receive the divine presence, and know ourselves, therefore, as all our being is given by God. And so again, it's not a million miles away, perhaps, from your experience with the communion of saints, that is at once utterly humbling, but also completely fulfilling and expansive. And maybe, the statue of Maria Lactans represented a similar kind of experience in the medieval imagination too.
Yes. And you when you shared that story, you talked about all of that kind of coming to you when you knelt, that you knelt there at the altar and then had this realization. And that it strikes me that's the difference between being obsessed with freedom and entering into this zone of divine outpouring that you mentioned, that there's a kind of bad interiority that leads to being trapped in a kind of zone of self-obsession in which there's no life because there's not a divine outpouring being received. You're just feeding on your own grief and fear and ambition. And we're not creatures meant to feed on ourselves. We're meant to receive the milk of another. And something about the kneeling seems to me to be critical to the story. It's not until you kneel that suddenly you realize, oh, this is what's happening at the altar, and this is the flow that made what's given at the altar possible in the first place. And that's the divine outpouring. I think that's such a startlingly clear instance of this is what we're made for, the kneeling and then the receiving of that flow.
Yeah, it was so powerful because as well, I'd sort of done all the work, and I'd even had this strange sort of coincidence of ending up in the other village with the figure, and all the pieces were there, but quite how they all sort of strung together, I didn't really know. And then, as you say, I knelt, and suddenly it was like literally it all lined up in my sight of vision, and like the twist of the kaleidoscope, where suddenly the pattern appears. Yeah, so it was a very visceral experience. That maybe that's how a lot of spiritual perception works, actually.
It's exciting it is, even now as we're talking, lining up for me, my own experience of the communion of saints and that sense of lining up. In fact, as I'm being consecrated as a bishop, we're processing in. And as we're processing in, right at the beginning of the experience, this thought came to me: your whole life is coming together as one now. And it was this, again, a sense of lining up, right? Like coming into the alignment that where all the tumblers kind of fall into place suddenly, and something opens. But then it's not something I opened. It's not something that I made happen or could have even know that I wanted to have happened. I wasn't hoping I would have that experience as I went into it. It wasn't on the horizon at all for me. And then suddenly there it is.
Yeah, no, I mean, it caught me by surprise. I knelt down originally because I was talking to some people, and I thought, oh, well, I'll just act out the moment that it might have been like for the medieval Christian. And then suddenly I was sort of in the zone too, and didn't even realize it, and it happened. Yeah.
That's beautiful. Mark, thank you for this. Thank you for your work. I hope people will pick up the Blake book and Secret History of Christianity. I know you have a Substack too. Remind everyone what that is.
Yeah, thank you. It's wonderful to talk about these things. And yeah, the Substack is a golden string. Blake said, I give you the end of a golden string, and you wind it into a ball. It will lead you in at heaven's gate, built in Jerusalem's wall. Actually sounds quite appropriate to what we're talking about. Just those lines. Yeah. So yeah. And I have a website, and I try and make sure that all the links are there as well, so you can find things.
I think part of what I would hope our listeners will do is pull on that string, because I think, what I love about the organic nature of our conversation today is, I'm talking to you because I talked to Rupert, and he said this, this has to happen. And I'd already had that experience of hearing you and how that connected to my own experience. So I think this is, in some small way, like a participation. So thank you for being willing to make time for it. And I hope we'll get to talk again.
Yeah, thank you so much. Because I feel like this dialogue form, even with this kind of free flow and seeing what emerges. I mean, I don't know whether you think about this, but I feel it's a sort of spiritual form for our times. I mean, a podcast can be lots of different things, but there are certain kinds of podcasts where, hopefully for the listener as well as for the participants, there's a sense of something emerging there and then. And to be a little bit pious about it, it's when 2 or 3 gather together and all that. And maybe the podcast in our times is part of this new quest for a kind of spiritual freedom that leads to this alignment, put it like that.
Absolutely. This is lovely. Mark, thank you so much. I appreciate the time and the conversation. Blessings on you, and we'll talk again soon.
Thank you. We're very glad for that.